your vocation, your calling, it might require you to speak in public, whether that's at an event that you're holding, or maybe it's at a workshop that you're presenting at, or maybe it's speaking to a camera, recording yourself to post a video online, or maybe you're recording an audio file to post for a podcast that properly expresses your work. Well, there are so many different modern paths that require you to speak out loud that if you are to learn how, you might want to study the career archetype of the public orator, because their calling is directly tied to speaking in public. And my name is Joe Yulee, and I'm a philosopher who is deeply obsessed with vocations and knowing which path to choose in this life and how to make it real in the 21st century. And that's why I'm here educating on places like YouTube or Instagram, or writing articles on Substack, or speaking on a podcast called the Career Archetypes podcast, because we all deserve to know what our calling is and what it is that we're meant to be doing with our lives, because a life where we're not pursuing our calling is one that we can end up resenting, where regret inevitably arises. And in my studies of unearthing career archetypes, I noticed that in studying the public orator career archetype, this archetype where the voice is at the center of its expression and of its path, there were so many different lessons that I'd learned from it that I wanted to share 5 different lessons that might help you, no matter what your path is, no matter what your career archetype is. There are so many takeaways when it comes to not only being able to present in public, but also just how to navigate the public domain. Now, the public orator career archetype is probably best personified by the life of Demosthenes, who was a famous, probably the greatest public orator of all time. Now, what was interesting about Demosthenes is that early on, he wasn't this great, expressive public speaker. And instead, what we had was someone with a stutter, someone that couldn't properly express their point, and someone that had little sway over public opinion. So this development of his growth into the greatest orator of all time is incredibly intriguing, and it holds a lot of different clues into the actual underpinnings of what makes the public orator, this career archetype, so great at what it is that they do. And one of the very first lessons that I learned in studying the public orator and studying great speakers, from Demosthenes to more modern speakers like a Winston Churchill, was that articulation is a skill. It's not something that you're naturally born with. They don't just come out of the womb suddenly being able to express long speeches of prose and properly illustrate and evoke proper emotions from people that will allow others to begin to sway towards their side. Instead, they learn deeply their craft. And the interesting thing here is that because they often start from this place of, hard circumstances, many of the different public orators that I looked at had stutters when they were young. They couldn't properly string words together. They were late in speaking at all. They had periods of years in their early life where their parents are worried about them being able to speak, and yet later on they end up being someone that can speak and express in such a way that they can completely energize and spark enthusiasm for their very words. They can even come from places that don't speak the native language that they needed to learn. So they might have come from a different land and had to learn a second language. And it was through that constant practice with the language they ended up developing this ability to properly express themselves. And this chipping away, you can imagine being at the bottom of a ladder. Having never had to be at the bottom, you wouldn't know how high the ladder was. But someone that was at the very, very bottom was able to understand every single step. And because they understood every single step, later on it ended up completing this full picture of mastery, whereas somebody that was never down at that base level didn't have to go through all the hardships that begun with. And so articulation is a skill rather than this natural, inborn ability that they were just given. Now, they did have a gift, and that is to say that all the different career archetypes that are out there, of which there are hundreds, maybe thousands, they all have different powers, They all have different gifts that are often associated with them. But these gifts have a ceiling that requires them to work towards it. So whilst they might inevitably find out that, hey, I'm very gifted in this area, or I'm very drawn to this thing, and know that one day I can be great, they still have to work at it. They still have to develop and cultivate that skill. And so if you are someone that is out there that is wanting to express, wanting to speak online, and you think that you should just have it immediately, you think that maybe you just press record and you jump on, and then you're able to just flow with poetry and drama, and your voice just resonates with everyone. Oftentimes it doesn't start like that. It takes a while. It takes development. It takes patience. It takes a consistent cultivation of the very skill itself. Which leads me to the second lesson that I learned from the Public Orator. And this lesson was that the crowd bends with the wind, and the Public Orator deeply understands that it bends with the wind, meaning that the opinion of the masses is typically going in a particular direction. Maybe it's going for something, or it's going against something, but it's always moving in a direction. And they understand that it's moving in a direction. They then will use that direction to aid what it is that their cause is all about. Maybe they're trying to influence the public that, hey, you should be moving towards my side of things, but the public is moving towards the opposite. So they have to create an argument, create a particular way of getting them to feel that the direction they're moving in is actually not the correct one. Or they will notice that everyone's moving in one direction, and they will push for an exaggeration of that direction. So they'll double down on it. But it's this awareness that the crowd is moving in a direction, and then saying, hey, do I want to be contrarian to this? Do I want to be anti this? Or do I want to double down on it? Do I want to exaggerate it? Do I want to make them all feel incredibly confirmed in what it is that they are thinking, they are believing, they are feeling as well? Which actually leads me to the next lesson that I learned from the Public Orator. And this was one of, it's sort of obvious, and yet so many people don't practice it, which is that emotion, not logic, is the great persuader. And if you are to study the different speeches of great public orators, you'll quickly find that within their speeches are arrows pointed at the hearts of the audience that they're addressing. And throughout their speeches, they're constantly shooting these emotions that evoke the audience, that constantly get them to viscerally feel what it is that they're saying. And so rather than bring out a chart with a graph and point at it and say, well, look at this graph and look at this number and here are all the facts, they look to hit them in a way that pulls their heartstrings and gets them to change their mind or to agree with the orator with a more deeply rooted conviction. And so they are very aware that emotions are what changes the tone of things and what changes the opinions of things. And because the public orator is always connected to influencing the world in some way, influencing the audience to think or feel or behave in some way, they care way more about the emotions of the content as opposed to the logical consistency of things. Now, if someone's to sit down there and properly dissect it in a very logical way, they're like, why does everyone believe this? Why does everyone think in this way? Well, it's because the public orator is saying, hey, I'm not going to focus on that. I might bring forward a fact, but only if it supports the emotion instead of the opposite, presenting a fact despite it doesn't agree with the emotional conveyance that they're attempting. Which leads me to the fourth lesson, which is preparation is a part of the performance. And if you're to go over the different public orators throughout time and this energy that is there, they end up realizing that they need to prepare, and that when they arrive at the performance, it's so ingrained in them that they don't even have to think twice. There's a famous story of Demosthenes prior to him going out there and delivering this epic speech, one of which would allow him to go against potential wrongdoers. So there was a story that Demosthenes was about 7 years old when his father died. He left him an inheritance. However, his guardians ended up spending his inheritance, and there was nothing that he could do about it. And so later on in life, he ended up to make sure that he would get what was owed to him, and he would do that through the court system. And so that's what he did. He learnt the art of speaking, and he learnt law in order to take his guardians to court in order to right the wrong and to get what was owed back to him. Now, he didn't end up getting everything that was owed back to him, but in the process, he ended up gaining justice, and also he ended up gaining a skill set that would allow him to provide and support for himself. And the famous story goes that prior to this, Demosthenes ended up shaving half of his face. He shaved like his hair on one side, half of his like mustache, half of his beard, and let the other one grow out. And the reason for this was that it would make him stay indoors, make him stay inside, away from anyone externally in the public, because he wouldn't want to be seen like that. And so what he would end up doing, being isolated and alone and inside, was practice, practice, practice. I mean, you can imagine 3 months of consistent practice, all for this climactic one moment of a speech. So many people will get to that one moment and they'll think that that's the event, or maybe a day before or 2 days before. But when you start to get into the sphere of people that have really mastered their own career archetype, you start to notice that they were preparing for months in advance. Every single detail mattered. Every single word that was uttered mattered. Every emotional change, shift, and pace, when the rhythm needed a certain way to go, it mattered. And they were acutely aware of every single piece of what it was that they were about to say. And so we can take this on and say, how much am I actually preparing prior to speaking, prior to presenting, prior to even expressing yourself in the workplace? Say that you're at a meeting and you want to speak up, but you haven't really spoken up before. Have you prepared for that moment? And by preparing for that moment, it will give you more confidence, give you more conviction in what you're saying, and make you a better speaker in general. And the 5th lesson that I learned was that good speakers are precise, but great speakers create believers. So there's a lot of this conversation or information, if you're to look into speaking online, whereby all the speech talk is around the precision of things, or the right tonality, or the right rhythm, as an example. It's all technical. And this makes people really good speakers. And if you want to be a really good speaker, then you can follow that path. But if you want to go to that next level, the public orator displays a way to get there. It's not simply about the technical, although that's a part of it, but it's also about the ability to infuse an emotional intentionality behind the words. There's a reason that very famous speeches come out of very particular moments, because underneath those speeches was this understanding of the context of the speech that had an atmosphere to it. It brought people to a new form of awareness and a new form of emotion because they were experiencing that very particular point in time. And so it transforms people in a way where they're like, whoa, what is that? How did that happen? Or feel so deeply in a way that maybe they haven't felt before or haven't felt for a very, very long time. And this transforms people into believing what the speaker is presenting them, what the speaker is telling them, and changes and shifts how they're expressing in the world, changes their literal behavior by hearing this. And so if you are someone that is deeply obsessed with the technical side of things, with the skill side of things, and you're wanting to improve your speaking in that way, know that that is a great start and that will get you going. However, there's this other side whereby you have to create a belief, and that's going to always start with you. You have to yourself believe your own words. And so if you talk from this place of integrity, of authenticity, your speech is naturally going to be stronger than somebody who studies all the techniques but isn't coming from this place of deep congruency and depth. And so these are the 5 lessons that I learned in studying the public orator. And there are hundreds of different career archetypes that can also teach us these different types of lessons. And so if you're interested in knowing what your own career archetype is and unearthing it for yourself, then I'll leave a link underneath this video to our Unearth membership. And inside that membership, we have a community and a course that guides members through this process of unearthing their very own career archetype. One of those career archetypes is the public orator. And then there are many other career archetypes that are also associated with speaking and a wide array of other areas. And by going through that process of unearthing, you'll know which career path to choose, and you'll know with conviction. And then you'll also be able to actually start walking the path and start to make it happen in the real world. So if you're interested in that, check out the link below.